The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help. On the long, tenuous, and expensive journey from startup to phase 3 clinical trials, biopharma company leadership comprises a risky game of what, when, who, and how. What's our next milestone or inflection point? When will we get there? Who do we need to get us there? And how are we going to do it? From those 4 questions spring thousands more iterations of the same 4 questions. One incredibly important example of which being, what's our commercial strategy going to look like? When will we kick it off in earnest? Who do we need to lead it? And how are we going to execute it? There's no prescription for commercial preparedness. When I ask 10 different biopharma CEOs when it starts, and I get 10 different answers. But at some point, as my guest on today's show will tell you, you have a lead candidate starting phase 3 trials and hopefully a few more behind it, filling the gaps. And by now, you better have a plan for what you're going to do with this thing when it hits. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech, and pre-commercialization strategy and preparedness is the topic we're about to dig into with Orca Bio Chief Commercial Officer, Dan Kirby. Orca is headed into phase 3 pivotal trials with an allogeneic stem cell candidate for AML, ALL, and MDS, and it's got plenty of other candidates to keep Dan on his toes following that. Dan, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
It is my pleasure. When you join, I want to jump right into like the starting point for you at Orca. When you joined there late in 2020, I'm assuming that timing was not sort of coincidental for Orca to bring a chief commercial officer on. As I mentioned, you're entering phase 3 with the Orca T candidate. Tell us a little bit about that. Back us up to 2020 when you joined the company. Tell us where Orca T was at the time and why that was a strategic time to bring you on.
Sure. 2020, going back, it actually was before I joined. I was talking to the team in mid-2020, and Orca T was in single-arm trials, both at Stanford and multi-center across the U.S. They were seeing great data, but we had not released the data yet. So the team showed me in August of 2020 what they were submitting to the ASH, or American Society of Hematology meeting. And that data just blew me away. Being with Juno, being in this industry for over 2 decades, rarely do you see data where a product is performing well above expectations and well above the current standard of care. So at that point, I was working for a publicly traded company, and I negotiated my way out and started with Orca in 2020. After we released the data and continued to treat patients on the single-arm trial, we were then approaching the FDA at our end of phase 2 to decide, should we move forward with filing right away, or should we go into a phase 3 randomized trial because we were in single arm to date with it. So what I would say is in 2020 was a very exciting time, but with the team coming out of Stanford, where the company originated out of Irv Weissman's lab, there wasn't a lot of commercial experience on the team. So the big questions they had were around the fact, not around the fact whether the asset worked or not. We could see that in the trials and the patient responses. The questions were, how is it going to be received from the community, from the physicians, from the payers, and from the patients? And how do we move forward in our trials or with our data to actually create a commercialized product out of something? Because it's more about the data that you're generating, hitting the unmet need versus just generating data and treating patients. So that was where the company was at an inflection point. And when I came in, I helped figure those things out and really prepare us for where we are today, where we are well into our phase 3 trial and hopefully finishing enrolling in the near future.
Yeah, I got a couple follow-ups for you on that. Like I'm sitting here thinking, okay, Dan Kirby has uh, experience from, as you said, Juno, and then head of U.S. commercial CAR T at Celgene after it acquired Juno. And I'm thinking, like, I mean, obviously you have integrity, Dan. I know that about you, but I'm thinking, wouldn't it be, couldn't it potentially be a false flag signal to the investor community to hire a high caliber chief commercial executive before a data readout?
It's a great
I,
question. It's
I
a
mean,
great question.
I know it's a bit of a curveball, but I'm just here thinking, like, boy, that would really send a message to me as an investor, like, wow, they got Kirby, let's go.
Well, I tell you, that's one of the things that we were very careful when I did come on board. So just to remind you a little bit about Orca, we're still private. So we had at the time and even now a finite number of investors, and we don't play to the markets because we're not a publicly traded company.
Mm-hmm.
So we deliberately did not put a press release out. We did more announcements on social media. We wanted to focus on the work that needed to be done and figuring things out than we were on trying to get new investors. We had already come out of stealth and done a round. So that is something that we're a little different. And that was part of the draw that brought me over to Orca, because being in public companies my entire life, you want to focus on the patient, but you have all these other distractions around you. Yeah. And so one of the draw of coming over to Orca was we could truly focus on how to bring this forward, how to generate data to show that we're making patients' lives better, that we're helping the healthcare system, that we're meeting unmet needs of the physicians that want to treat their patients the best way possible. But the thing that you love about being in a private company that's gone to this stage is, our actions speak louder than words with the investors. And being private, we don't have to worry about looking at the daily ticker on your stock and how well it does, and about who you bring in and that sentiment. We want to focus on the right things, which is improving patient care, and let everything else fall into place. Yeah. So that is one of the attractions for me coming on from a public company to a private company.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So making that transition from bigger, public company in the cell therapy space to a smaller private company, tell us a little bit about what that experience at Celgene and Juno kind of taught you and prepped you for about the commercialization of cell therapies that transfers to a company like Orca. Like for instance, when in the clinical journey are you ideally sort of going, okay, as the chief commercial officer, we're going to form up this value proposition? Or does that happen like before you even take over chief commercialization officer duties?
Well, great questions, a lot to unpack. So I'll start with the first part of that and get into your second part. The first part of that, I came up through Amgen. It was a great experience on how to work your way up the ladder, how to understand in a larger environment, learning from great people on the right way of doing things. So when I came over to Juno, I was actually brought over there from the ex-head of oncology on the commercial side at Amgen. Mm-hmm. And we worked close together from the very beginning at Juno about understanding where the value proposition was. Our trials were already underway, but we were feeding inputs into what we needed to do to the trials. Did we need to add cohorts so we could have better payer acceptance? Then we could show data on patients that the payers wanted to see, the physicians wanted to see, et cetera. Transitioning that into Celgene, which was a bigger company than Juno, we kind of had grown up at that point with it. And with Celgene had a lot of resources, and that is great at being at big companies, having those resources there, being able to do everything that you want to do inside of your plan. Now I'll transition to the second part of your question regarding the how soon is it and the difference between a smaller company. One of the things I can say at the larger companies, the value proposition is always there, but it's handed off from person to person. At a smaller company, it really truly is a small cross-functional team moving things forward. So the value proposition for Orca T, for instance, has always been about improving survival and reducing toxicity versus the current standard of care. Mm-hmm. But there are certain aspects there that would make that value story more robust and more acceptable from a physician standpoint, from a payer standpoint, from a patient standpoint. So It's never really too early to think about that as you design your trials. But one of the key aspects that we did, because I was on as we got through our phase 2, as I mentioned, but also I was able to do a lot of work with those three stakeholders, the physician, the patient, and the payer, to understand what they would need to see out of the trial. What do they need to see to truly have a valuable product coming out on the other side of it? So we designed our phase 3 trial with a chronic graft versus host disease free survival endpoint. So we have toxicity and survival in the primary endpoint with the FDA. And that is deliberate, because if you look at this from a physician standpoint, they want their outcomes to get better. They want these patients to make it through the other side of their cancer journey, not only free of cancer, but not living with toxicities from the treatment that cured their cancer. So there was a tremendous request there and need there from a physician mindset. Mm-hmm. From a patient mindset, you talk to the survivors that have made it through their journey, and they've traded, in a lot of cases, their cancer in for chronic graft versus host disease, which can affect their organs, can make them go blind because they can't produce tears, and can ultimately lead to their death. So these patients they're our survivors, so the ones we celebrate, but we can do better for them. And from a payer perspective of talking to the payers, this idea of chronic GVHD to them is real. They pay 2 to 3 times more to treat these patients on the other side of the standard of care treatment for the toxicity that they have, whether it be hospitalization, expensive drugs to manage, or just even paying for their psychological help as they go through living a life where they can't walk outdoors that much because their skin is bothered by this graft versus host disease with it. If we're able to avoid it and show the payer that we can take these toxicities and prevent them with a better therapeutic treatment, then they see the benefit not only for the patient quality of life, but also too, we take away all those costs that they have for years on these patients. So we designed our trial with those endpoints. We also are looking at relapse-free survival, relapse and graft versus host-free survival, the chronic graft versus host disease, acute graft versus host disease, and infections as all kind of endpoints of our trial, so we can show the benefits that we have to all those stakeholders in ways that are meaningful to them.
Yeah. I want to I guess further understand the relationship between the clinical trial and the value proposition that's sort of, payer, patient, and physician facing. I mean, it sounds like they sort of inform one another and develop as they go. But I mean, help me better understand like how they influence one another, and like what you start with. Like you go into a clinical trial. There's got to be some semblance clearly of an external facing value proposition to even recruit patients and physicians to be involved. So I don't know, maybe I don't even know how to ask the question. It might be a very difficult one to ask because it's probably not prescriptive, but just give me some more flavor on how they inform one another.
Sure. Absolutely. By doing the homework up front, you know exactly what your input should be. If you walk in with these endpoints to a physician, they're going to want to use the product. If you walk in with these endpoints to a payer, they see the logic in covering this product. If a patient sees those endpoints, they're meaningful to them. Mm-hmm. So, thinking about that in context of, I think what your question's getting at is, well, if it's that easy, why doesn't everybody do it, right?
Yeah.
Actually look at clinical trials. People have designed clinical trials on onset to action endpoints, for instance. And you say that you may work faster than another therapy. Well, what's the benefit of working faster? Is it 3 less days of hospitalization? Or is it that your product is avoiding complications on that quicker onset of action? There's some type of clinical benefit other than just that you work faster. Other endpoints in trials may be lower bars to hit. So when you're dealing with small companies that are trying to advance their products forward, you want to make a difference in the world. So you want to work for the companies that are doing the work that you're proud of. And, with Orca, definitely I can say that's a great match for me because our endpoints are real. But, when clinical trials are going to go after lower endpoints that are easier to hit, and they just collect data on the side about hospitalizations, about long-term survival, about other metrics there that aren't exactly powered in their trial, but their trial is powered for a much lower bar to hit. They may get to the market a little quicker. They may be able to entice, like you said, those public shareholders with some, hey, we're moving through with the FDA fast. But are you really making a difference? And then when you go in front of those physicians, are you bringing them something that is proven to be better for their patients? Are you going in front of a payer saying, no, I want you to cover this product versus the standard of care because either it works quicker or some other lower bar? You want to be able to walk in front of them and say, no, these are real benefits to the patients. And then, of course, with the patient mindset, you want to prove that your product is worthy to be treated for those patients and give them a better chance when they have options. So the context with your message I would get is a little bit of, it seems pretty straightforward. Why doesn't everybody do it? And the answer is, yes, it does seem straightforward, but not everybody does it. And that's
Gotcha.
that, hopefully that helps out with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also curious about the commercial influence on pivotal trial design. I mean, that's a relationship that it seems to me could be mishandled if allowed. Tell me about your experiences there and just generally how you formed up sort of your worldview on the role of commercial in pivotal trial design. You sound to me as you speak as though you could be a chief clinical officer just as well as a chief commercial officer.
Well, thank you for that. I would never put myself in their shoes. I have a tremendous respect for what,
I'm sure that's reciprocal.
Oh, and I've worked with some great ones over my time. What I would say is that, when you think about commercial in this sense, you have to not think about commercial as a consumer product. That's people tend to make that mistake with life sciences, biotech, cell therapy, et cetera. Our products are designed to help patients. So really the commercial mindset in there is, hey, let's put together the best trial that will prove the benefits of our product and let the product speak for itself. I've always had that in every single launch I've been involved in for the last 25 or so years, is that, the job from a promotional aspect is just to get people to try it. The product will speak for itself. If you have a good product, it will work. Your point about trial design is really making sure that you sync up and you listen to the customers. So one of the things that you can do from a side of being a physician, and this is why I'd say my colleagues and I complement each other very well, because I'll bounce ideas off of them, they bounce them off of me, is that if you get into the mindset of what these physicians are looking for, or what the payers are willing to cover, or what the patients are willing to go through with your therapy, it helps really kind of give yourself the true north of what do you need to do to accomplish these things. And, this is less about the commercial side of it where revenue's generated, et cetera, because if you have a product that works well and people are using it and they're seeing the results, revenue and everything else will come. But you've got to get that right up front. So that's one of the things, partnership between the medical side, the commercial side, the development side, all of us working together with that goal in mind. And I've always said to them, on the other side of it, when you give me the keys to the car, I want it to be something that we're proud to drive. So this means we've proven the right things. And at the end of the day, when you look back, and I was told this a few years ago, actually before I joined Juno from one of the people there, you want to do things in your career now when you're sitting on that chair in front of the fireplace and you have, whether it be your grandkids, your nieces, your nephews, but somebody asks you what you did with your career, you can hold your head up high and say, I made a difference. I did everything I could to help make a difference. And I worked with great people along the way. Yeah. So that's kind of the commercial mindset. I know it's not as much dollars and cents, but again, if you can have the right product that has the right endpoints and have people use it, it ultimately helps patients and helps the healthcare system in totality, you'll have something to be proud of. And then everything else just follows that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good, thorough answer. It raises the question for me about sort of the processes or systems, or I guess, processes or systems that are used to facilitate the interdisciplinary interactions, I guess, between clinical, commercial, you even mentioned development like, is there any degree of formality to the way that these, and maybe not, you don't have to answer this like, yeah, in specific Orca terms or even specific Juno terms, but in your experience, have you found there to be processes, systems, or tools that best enable that sort of interdisciplinary interaction? And I asked that question knowing full well that, like, perhaps some of that strategy interaction and back and forth isn't necessarily stuff that has to be documented from a regulatory standpoint. Right. You know what I mean? So like, maybe it doesn't have to be documented or formal, but I'm wondering if it should be and if it is for your benefit, right?
Yes. So the documentation there, I'm not really an expert on that part of it, but regulatory is in the discussions with it as well as legal. Mm-hmm. Your question about structure, I think in the larger companies, it's very structured and very formatted. You can argue maybe sometimes too much because there are so many stakeholders there. You have to pass it through several committees for it. When you go to smaller companies, naturally we all work together. We're all sitting on the same leadership team. We're all going in the same direction, and you're putting 10 people at a table because they're the 10 people that are covering those sections of the company, not 5 different meeting groups of 10 that elevate to a group of 5 that'll make an ultimate decision. So it's a little bit different, the governance in smaller versus larger. That said, with regulatory and document, you have to be conscious to stay in your own swim lane. So I could again share, here are the endpoints that are meaningful, but then it's really up to the development, medical, and regulatory colleagues to work with the regulatory authorities to design the trial. So,
right.
That is,
yeah, that's I think that's the point. I was like, if you follow the path from like CMC through development, regulatory, like those folks, the product as it moves through that chain, it's almost like, yes, we're aware everything we need to do, everything we do needs to be documented, and it is, and we have systems and procedures and policies for that, or else we just don't play the game. Like if you don't do it, you don't play the game. Right, so I guess that was my question. Like when you don't necessarily, when you have interactions between departments like commercial and clinic, clinops and that kind of thing, where there isn't necessarily like a regulatory body expecting documentation of every move, just what best practices look like to ensure that you're continue to paddle in the same direction.
I think it's a little bit different on the commercial side because, again, especially when you don't have a product on the market, you're feeding endpoints there, but you're talking about more steering the company.
Yeah, right. I'm talking about from a management perspective,
Right. But one perspective outside of the documentation down to, say, cell therapies, for instance, is, as you're building out your manufacturing, obviously you have your regulatory regulations or specs that you have to hit. But even the scale of your manufacturing build out, you have to reconcile your forecast between what your anticipated demand is along with what your manufacturing capacity, especially in cell therapies where you're talking about individualized patient products. Yeah. So you're making a product for a specific patient. So that is a lot different than biologics where you're manufacturing a batch of products that are stored at a wholesaler then shipped out. So there is much more of a synchronization between manufacturing, demand forecasting, finance, and commercial demand to make sure that we're reconciled, that we can actually make the products that are wanted from our customers.
Yeah, that's a good point. You teed up my segue just beautifully, because I know that's not just bluster, the comparison you're making between cell and gene and more traditional biologic therapies. You worked for a while as chief commercial officer for Omeros. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay. Yeah. Commercial stage biopharma company, multimodality, some more traditional biologics there. So you've got some takes there, and I'd like you to open up a little bit more about the differences in commercial preparation from, between ATMPs, let's generalize them, advanced therapeutic medicinal products, and more traditional biologics. Our audience, we have listeners that play in both of those, all of those fields. So I think you bring an interesting perspective on the nuances and differences between the two.
Absolutely. And I think when you're going for a biologic launch or a small protein or small molecule, I should say, launch versus a cell therapy. There are definite differences there. What I can say, and again, back to the experience of every company I've been in, is truly developing products that'll help patients, and that is true whether it's Amgen, Juno, Celgene, Omeros, or Orca. You're just doing it a little bit differently. So synchronization, and you talk about manufacturing, I mentioned that before. You have to be very aware that you can't manufacture a batch of drug for cell therapy. So for the Orca perspective there, I mentioned it's patient by patient. Also, too, commercial preparation is with the payer a lot. I mentioned that before as well. The difference between cell therapies and other, say, biologics is that cell therapies are one-time treatments in most cases. So you're trying to cure the patient of a disease in one administration of your product. Whereas, if you can think about other products that are used to chronically treat, or they're doing a great job for patients, but they're given in monthly doses and they could be given for 2 to 3 years. So the value of the product is recouped over time in small increments. With cell therapies, it's a one-time administration. So there are options about value-based pricing that are being explored, I think, a little bit more outside of the US, but it's coming into the US. More and more of how do you look at this to actually appropriate value over time with a single administrative product. But it is something you have to think forward looking at as you're preparing to launch, and working with the payers, understanding what your strategy should be. And it really is a situation where no one's figured it out yet. Cell therapy is a newer field, cell and gene therapy, and it's evolving. Whereas biologics back in the day with Amgen and Genentech, when they were starting out, Biogen and several others, it was the same feel with coming out with biologics. It was a different ball game than it was the small molecules that had been there in the past with it. Cell therapy is going through that now. We've been around on the market. I believe the first cell therapy was approved in 2017. So you're talking right now 6 years on the market for cell therapies. So it's still very young, and those conversations are constantly evolving with the payers, with the physicians, of how to handle this and make sure that we can provide patient access. Because at the end of the day, pricing is just one way of ensuring that patients can access your product. And that is something that we're all focused on. It's evolving, but it's different than, say, a biologic.
As manufacturers look to automate, scale, and reduce risk in cell therapy process development, there are more options than ever before. Tune in each week to learn about cell processing, manufacturing platforms, and more. The pod is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva, a global provider of technologies and services that advance and accelerate the development, manufacture, and delivery of therapeutics, including cell therapies. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. Yeah, I mean, considerably different, and I'm wondering about your perspective on that. Like, I don't know. I'm hoping that chief commercial officers in cell therapy companies get paid considerably more. No offense to chief commercial officers in biologics and small molecule companies, because of that challenge is, I say that jokingly, because the challenge is like inherently more difficult when you have like, is it Elevitus, a $3.2 million DMD therapy that was just approved? I get it. Like the president is saying it could be a $5 million therapy and still be cost justified, and that's fantastic. But there are still, a lot of cases where frontline payers are going to say, there's no way, no matter how you rationalize it, like we're probably not going to go down that path. So, just tell me about your perspective on that. How does that one-time curative therapy concept sort of affect your commercial strategy? And do you ever wish for the small mall days?
Well, I think every commercial job has its own challenges. As far as pay goes, I can't comment on that. I don't think
I know. I say that.
I don't
say
think
that tongue in cheek.
Paid more or less, but I can tell you, if you're in smaller companies, I think your motivation is more tied to the success of the company than it is the cash you're getting. Put it that way. So I don't think smaller companies pay necessarily more than larger companies, but you're focusing on the mission and everything works itself out. There are different challenges if you can think about that. If you go through with a lot of cellular therapies, you have a clear patient benefit. So that is something that you have curative therapies in a lot of ways. Not saying every cell and gene therapy is curative, but you have that potential to cure a disease or save a life with one-time administration of your product. So it's a little bit different where small molecules, I'm sure most of us have been on a small molecule in our life. They are absolutely tremendous about, extending life, curing disease, illness, et cetera. So that's something where there's always value out there. The challenges commercially with this are just different. There's a lot of things you have to think through. One example here is that if you have a patient with a terminal cancer and that patient needs to wait for an insurance verification for the payer to say, yes, it's covered, then that has to happen in a shorter time period than somebody who has a chronic illness that's not fatal. So that is the complexity you need to build in. Also, too, when you're shipping product from your manufacturing site directly into the academic center that's going to administer the product, that there's some nuances there that need to happen and need to get thought through as far as what your distribution strategy is with it. A little bit different than if you go to AmerisourceBergen, McKesson, or Cardinal and have them warehouse your product because you can make a batch of it and have that there. There are challenges there with expiry product, et cetera, that you'll have when you use that realm. But when you're making a product specifically for that patient, there are a lot of different things that need to happen in real time for that patient to get the product as soon as possible, because the outcome if they don't. So you need to think through those. Those are a little bit different. It's not necessarily, it's a different challenge than others have. And the path really hasn't been solidified. There have been some great work from everybody over at Gilead Kite. My old company became eventually Bristol Myers Squibb, and Novartis that pioneered it, but Bluebird's out there now. A lot of companies are out there now with their therapies trying to figure out what's the best way to deliver them to patients. Now, as far as your other question, talking about price tag for your product, everybody does that work to say, okay, what's the optimal, what's the value of the products? How am I going to price it? How am I going to work with payers to make sure it's covered for patients? All of that are still going to have their own journey by company. And it's something you have to work through. I'd say the one perspective, and this goes for either a biologic into a cell therapy, is you need to listen to the payers, listen to the physicians, partner with the advocacy groups, the patient advocacy groups, to really be able to understand what is the optimal value of your product in there, and make pricing decisions carefully with it. And I think everybody is, but each company will have their own particular journey for that.
Yeah. I didn't ask the question like as though I were a guest. I get it. I'm just curious, I was curious if the equation, if the calculus of the thing was, effectively transferable, whether we were talking about small mole or traditional biologic or cell and gene. So
it is and it isn't. I would say there's certain aspects of it. The baseline of what you do is very similar. There are nuances that I've mentioned before that you have to think through, because it's not quite the same as going through a tried and true process. So you do have to look at hybrid solutions. And I can say the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, or as we call them, ARM, is a great group of these gene and cell therapies that we get together. We talk about things. It's a safe environment where we can share ideas back and forth about how we're thinking about things, and how we're thinking about commercialization. And that's been extremely helpful because we learn from each other.
I think about, there are the obvious, points of differentiation that contribute to that cost dynamic. One of them you just referenced being supply chain and logistics. It's obviously an incredibly different challenge and problem to face than with even a monoclonal antibody, for instance. what do you see happening in recent months, years, and what do you see happening in the coming, maybe months and years that is contributing to a more favorable conditions to actually have levers and dials and knobs to turn and push and pull to impact and affect payer reception of the products? Like, would logistics be one, for instance? Like, I mean, do you see improvements in the logistics infrastructure that, is making that less daunting? Other technologies, processes, whatever it might be. What's your, we can, I don't want you to make dangerous forward-looking statements, but what's sort of your forecast, generally speaking, on efficiencies to be gained?
Sure. And I can tell you in the past 6 years, there have been a lot of efficiencies gained. I think when you looked at it from a perspective, when the first CAR Ts launched, there was a significant delay in intent to the order actually being placed. And part of that was it was all new to the insurance companies. It was new to the centers that were ordering the product. So they wanted to make sure that they had that thoroughly vetted before allowing the physician to place the order. That time frame has shrunk considerably. And I expect that progress will continue to happen. And we'll see this being approved or coverage being clarified in days, not weeks, which I think we've gotten to with more established with the CAR Ts in most cases. But there is a big movement in the industry, along with the payers and the manufacturers and the providers, to make sure that we can get those verifications quicker and quicker. There are also other initiatives. CMS has been absolutely outstanding in creating a code, a DRG 018, a drug grouping code for CAR Ts and other T-cell immunotherapies that can provide access for patients. They created that code a few years ago, and most of the innovative products are going down that road. So we've seen those movements going forward. CMS also is looking at value-based regarding Medicaid, and is always open to dialogue through either CMS or CMMI. From a payer perspective, I think that most of the payers are embracing this. They understand the complications and what these products are trying to treat, and are committed to working together. The one area that I'll say, without looking too far in the future, is these things won't get solved overnight, but progress has been made over the last 6 years. Progress will continue to be made as we move forward. But what I can say is we're marching together on this. All of us want the patients to receive the therapies that will save their lives or make them better. So that is the common true north we all have, and we're working towards that. So I think it's not going to change overnight. It's going to keep getting better. But if you look at biologics as an example and how that evolved over time, we have a bright future.
It's a good, thorough response with good examples of progress. So thank you for that, Dan. I want to get your perception of the relationship between commercial and the regulatory team, both at Orca and just the regulatory environment in general. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about small molecule biologics or cell and gene. We know that the FDA applies rigorous standards to everything that they assess. The perception could be, the perception is, I should say that, in cell and gene therapies in particular, that gauntlet might be a little bit more daunting. Is it?
I think it's pretty high to start with. I mean, regulatory is at the core of everything that we do. If you think about what our companies are doing, we're producing products that make patients' lives better. Obviously, you don't have a business unless people are using your product. They're not going to use your product unless you're improving patients' lives one way or the other, whether saving them or curing the common cold, et cetera, or treating different illnesses. What I can say with it is that because this is healthcare, regulatory is embedded in every single thing that we do. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's any different. In my experience, it hasn't been. At Amgen, we were completely entrenched with our regulatory colleagues, making sure we did things the right way and documented them the right way. That has followed through with every single company that I've been at, including Orca, ensuring I'm very close with our regulatory lead, and she's been phenomenal since she came onto the company about being a sounding board and a true partner. A lot of times it's about how you do things and doing them the right way than what you do, because it's how you approach things, how you say things, and making sure that you always keep in mind that there's a patient on the other end of every single thing that we do. And we have a mission to help those patients. But regulatory and what our regulatory colleagues say, as well as what the regulations, the FDA and EMA put out there, those are our guiding points, and we follow them regardless of small company to big company, small molecule to cell therapy to biologic.
Yeah. I've been bouncing all over the place here. In terms of the commercial interaction internally in new and emerging bio, or large bio for that matter, we've talked about several points. Clin ops, we've talked about regulatory, we've talked about some supply chain a bit. I want to make sure that we're covering them all, though. Like in your day to day, right, running the commercial outfit, in your personal role, who else and what else are you strategically in lockstep with to ensure that you're doing the good job you should be doing to prep Orca for commercial?
Well, I'd say the three biggest functions that I deal with on a daily basis are finance, medical, and legal. Making sure, legal/regulatory, I should say, that making sure that we're lockstep in what we're doing with it. And I say that because from a finance perspective, we need to make sure that we're syncing up on the forecast, that the cash burn that we're doing is lining up. When I say cash burn, there's a lot of things we could do, but it's the timing we should do those to make sure we're doing those appropriately, especially in a smaller company where you want to make sure that you have your runway as long as possible. From a medical perspective, making sure we're in lockstep and we're taking the insights that we're gaining from our stakeholders and communicating those and talking back and forth about what we can do both now and then in the future with other products and other areas we may decide to go into. And then from legal regulatory, the points we've talked about, ensuring that we're doing things the right way and that we're making sure that there's open communication for that. I've always found in my experience from that lens, involving stakeholders early in what you're doing, you have a far better product on the other side. It's far more compliant and it's aligned with the company's mission if you involve those stakeholders throughout your entire process. So they're my three kind of partners on a daily basis.
Yeah, very good. When I reflect on your career, what I know of it, it's difficult for me to reflect too deeply on your career. We just met, but when I look at your career on paper, and I see that you started out as a sales rep, as carrying the bag, as they say at GSK a long time ago. Then you moved into marketing at Amgen, and then onto the roles that we've already discussed. I love that story. Like I love the fact that a big time chief commercial officer started out carrying the bag in pharmaceutical sales. I think it's outstanding. I've had CEOs of biopharmas on the show who have done the same. So congratulations to you. But more importantly, the thing that strikes me about that is that who on earth would be better informed to serve in a role like yours than someone who's seen it, right? From the physician's perspective as a young man in pharmaceutical sales all the way on up. You've seen a lot, right? Like you've seen it all. So maybe I'm stating the answer to the question, but I'm just wondering if you could reflect for a minute on how those sort of patient and clinician facing roles early on informed your worldview now as someone in charge of biopharma commercialization.
Sure. It's a great question, and I was blushing when you were talking on there. I think that there are a lot of great people who've done different things, and there's no one true path to get there with it. I can talk about my journey, and other people have their journeys with it. I can say I do draw on that because you eat, live, and breathe with the customers on a daily basis. You sit in the waiting room with the patients. And doing that for years, you have an idea of what makes the doctors tick, and really it is about patient care too. But when you actually, and I started a long time ago, I'm not going to divulge my age, but I was there's a little bit different back in the day. So you would hear in the 90s, so physicians talking to patients, and you would experience a lot of what they were going through and those conversations. And it really was, it put a big impression on me about making sure that you are more of a partner and get to know the physicians and understand that they're treating patients that could be you, could be me, could be any of our loved ones, and making sure that you understand where their priorities are and seeing things from their light. Carrying the bag, so to speak, was really a tremendous experience that I would never, ever have viewpoints that I have without having done that and experiencing that. It is interesting sitting in offices and waiting for that interaction, albeit how short it could be. I remember in the early 2000s sitting there when I was with Amgen, and you could see the patients in the rheumatologist's office that their hands were crippled and their hands were crumbled and that they were in wheelchairs. And this was right before the TNFs hit. Mm-hmm. And Enbrel, Humira, Remicade, et cetera. And looking at, if you walked into one of those offices today, you don't see as many wheelchairs, if you see any. Depends on what doctor you're in, but you see differences in the patients and that flashing forward. And that made as big of an impression as anything else on it. But I do say that there are many ways to get there, different ways of listening to customers. But I am one that does like to interact and, talk to the thought leaders out there and make sure that our company is listening to them on what they feel is important and how we should be going forward with it. And that does go back in the days of all those physicians that taught and educated me. And I always say that they were my teachers, because I'd walk in and I would ask them what they thought, and we would have discussions about the products and how they're using it for their patients. But, they would teach me a ton about not only what it is to be a physician practicing medicine, but to be a person treating a patient. And that is at the core of kind of a lot of my viewpoints going forward with it. And I wouldn't take that back for the world. But again, I do want to say there are many paths to follow. That's just the path that I did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, it's a stout path. We're running short on time here, Dan, but I want to give you an opportunity. You've given us a ton of pithy nuggets of wisdom. You've shared a lot of value here. But if you had concluders, I guess parting shots to share with the audience around wisdom for near commercial stage biopharma companies, you're more than welcome.
And first of all, thank you for having me. I'd say that just the one thing, looking at companies that are emerging, whether you're doing a cell therapy, a small molecule, or a biologic, I get asked a lot from former colleagues who haven't had the commercial background. When do I bring commercial in? What's the right things I should be doing? Should I bring a CCO in? How should I be thinking about this? And I think the standard answer that I have to that is, it first depends on what you want to accomplish and what stage you're at. But it's never too early to understand from those three stakeholders I talked about, the physician, the payer, and the patient, what their priorities are and what you're going after. And keep that in mind as you walk through. Understand your market landscape. Use the customer, or I should say those three stakeholders, who are your customers, mm-hmm. to guide you on your journey with it. And if you can stay true to what they want and what their priorities are, that's your best bet going forward. And when you actually bring headcount on a commercial, it could be early, it could be late, based on your confidence of where you are. That person you bring on will be so grateful that you followed the path and listened to the outside world. And you're going to see the results as your company grows.
It sounds to me like you've had some experience with, the not so prepared entree into chief commercial officer status. You said, I'm just saying, you said that person's going to be so grateful. They might only be grateful if they've seen the other side, if they've seen the situation where perhaps that groundwork has not been laid.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. in your career, when I decided to leave Celgene and take my first CCO role, I talked to a lot of companies. And I think one of the commonalities that I saw in the companies that were looking is they were 12 to 18 months from launch and they wanted to hand everything over. Yeah. And those were opportunities where I had to politely say, this is way too late. You have not done the work you needed to do. Your trial design is not going to show a realistic benefit. So you need to take a step back and look at what you're actually coming forward with, and not expect somebody to come in as your CCO and wave a magic wand. You need to understand from the beginning that you are bringing a product forward to help patients, that you're going to have to deal with how payers are going to view you, how physicians are going to view you, and ultimately, are you putting the right value proposition on board to help as many patients as possible? So my experience with that, thank goodness, has not been in companies I've been at, but I saw more companies that were in that stage that thought of it as an afterthought. And if you look at the commercial launches that occur, a commonality of some of the ones that have not gone so well is they haven't brought the commercial side in until the last minute because they didn't prioritize it.
Yeah. There's a lot more to talk about, but as I said, we're short on time. So I'm going to have you back on to talk about some more post-commercial planning, risk analysis, that kind of thing. But in the meantime, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's been very insightful, and I appreciate you for coming on and being so transparent with our audience.
I did as well. Thank you so much, Matt, for having me.
Thank you. So that's Orca Bio Chief Commercial Officer Dan Kirby. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online, part of the Life Science Connect community, and sponsored by Cytiva, whose support of new and emerging biopharma companies is on full display at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. If you like listening in on conversations with leaders like Dan, subscribe to the Business of Biotech podcast. Sign up for our newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB, and also be sure to leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. And as always, thanks for listening.